What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Templar. Magicka Templar has kind of, before Wolfhunter has kind of been a build that not many people used to run, because it wasn't pulling very good DPS when compared to stamina DPS, so melee Magplars were not doing very well, and then in terms of range, they weren't doing very well compared to the Nightblades, who were pulling the highest DPS and still are pulling the highest DPS. However, Magplars did happen to get a buff in Wolfhunter. They managed to get their execute buffed to the point where it's actually usable now as an actual execute, and they also had a couple of changes to a couple of their skills. So now Magicka Templars are actually doing fairly well in terms of pure DPS. There have been reports that Magicka Templars are actually able to outparse Magicka Sorcerers. I personally have not been able to do it, but the best Magplars, from what I've heard, have been able to parse similar to, if not beat out, the best Magicka Sorcerers in the game right now. So there is that aspect of Magicka Templars. The buffs to J-Beam really did help them push their DPS over to compete against Magicka Sorcerers. However, unlike Magicka Sorcerers, they do not have a unique synergy to use. So in that regard, Magicka Sorcerers still bring a little bit more utility to the table. However, Magicka Templars are very good for progression-style teams because they do have faster res time. Plus, they also are one of the only sources of minor sorcery for the group. So Magicka Templars, while they might not have a unique synergy, do bring a good amount of group utility, regardless of the group, whether it's progression or a score running guild. So, like the rest of our build videos, we're going over skills, gear, CP point distributions, race, attributes, everything you need to know to kind of remake this build yourself. I will mention here that this build is optimized around having an organized raid group, so there will be a couple of assumptions that I'm making here, and I will go over certain replacements for gear and skills, as well as some CP point options. For those groups that might not have an optimized raid group, or who might be doing a progression guild, and or might be just doing different fights or different strategies. So let's go ahead and get started here, first with gear. So we are playing within melee range here, so this is one of the assumptions here for this particular build, is that we'll be able to be within melee range. So if we're able to be in melee range, we're going to be using Zaan. Zaan is still the strongest monster helm for Magicka DPS, as long as you're able to stay within melee range. The one thing with Zaan, though, is that it is only single target DPS. It'll only ever hit one enemy, and you do have to stay within 8 meters of the enemy. So if the boss is moving around a lot, the Zaan loses a fair amount of power, just because it's not able to tick. Those last couple of ticks are what really makes Zaan very powerful, and you're not able to get those last couple of ticks if the boss moves out of that 8-meter radius from you. So in those instances, you will not be running Zaan. For those more mobile fights, you will be running Skoria instead. So that's kind of the two monster helm sets that you will primarily be using here. If you are also using a shock damage enchant, I'll go over kind of weapon enchants in a second. You could also use Lambrus, but generally speaking, just having that one shock enchant typically isn't enough to really help push Lambrus over Skoria. Sometimes they'll beat it, sometimes it won't. Skoria will be a lot more consistent DPS compared to Lambrus that way. And that's only, you only run Lambrus if you're using a shock damage enchant. Now you will notice too that Skoria does have a max health set bonus, while Zaan and Lambrus have spell crit and smash crit respectively. So that we are using Witchmother's potent Brew to help us sustain. So because of that, if you're going to be using Zaan or Lambrus, you will need to have a health enchant on one of your big pieces. Typically, I just choose a monster helm, just because it's very easy for me to remember to do so. So that's where we have our health enchant there. We are going 5-1-1, so 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy. Because our armor sets, all the armor sets that we have, like all the options, are all light, your medium and heavy pieces will come from your monster health. So it doesn't matter which one is which, so you can have heavy shoulders, medium head, or heavy head and medium shoulders, as long as you have 1 medium or 1 heavy. Now for our first five-piece set, this set is what's going to be active on both bars, so both on your front bar and your back bar. We're going with Siroria. I have the perfect version here. You can go with the imperfect version. This drops from Cloud Rest, perfect from vet, imperfect from normal. The difference between them is just that 5-piece max Magicka bonus there, so the imperfect version doesn't have it. So it is a little bit less DPS, but not too much so. The 5-piece remains exactly the same between perfect and imperfect. So one thing I will point out here is that Siroria is very strong, even if you're not able to maintain very high stacks, mainly because it gives you a very nice spell damage bonus, but also because of that minor slayer as well. That adds a little bit of damage there, even if you're not really able to maintain very good stacks. Siroria is definitely better used with fights where you're able to be fairly stationary, or in fights where you're able to return to that ring every 5 seconds. So for more mobile fights, for example, Cloud Rest or Asylum, those are the two main trials where Siroria is not going to be quite as strong. In that instance, you might want to decide to swap out Siroria. You do have several options when it comes to other body sets that you might want to run. The first one being Burning Spellweave. Burning Spellweave is definitely a very strong set. Doesn't have Minor Slayer, but because we do have Vampire's Bane, which is also fire damage, we do have fairly good chance uptime with Burning Spellweave on a Magicka Templar. Other options do include things like Julianos, which is a perfectly good set. It's very easy to get. It's a craftable set, so it's very good set to tide you over until you're able to farm Siroria or Burning Spellweave. You could also run Master Architect too. The danger of using Master Architect is it has to be on your body. So we can't have it on the front bar set because we have Crescent Sweep on our back bar. So you will need to have it on your body piece. And you will be using Crescent Sweep as your primary ultimate, which means you will lose a little bit of personal DPS in exchange for giving everybody else Major Slayer. It's typically going to be the 2 melee DPS close to you. Now you can use Master Architect and you can use Crescent Sweep even if you're at ranged, but obviously if you decide to use Crescent Sweep while you're at ranged, it doesn't do any damage. So that's kind of something you want to take into consideration if you do want to replace Siroria with Master Architect. You're only going to be able to really use it to its fullest potential if you're able to be in melee range. So those are kind of options for your front bar sets. You can also go with Mother Sorrow too if you're not going to be running it as a front bar set. So Mother Sorrow is our front bar set here. This is only going to be active on our front bar here. So we have 3 weapons and or 3 jewelry pieces and a weapon. You can go with body pieces as well. It's just that I prefer to have Mother Sorrow as jewelry just because if you do want to run Perfect Skoria, the jewelry only drops from Vet Cloud Rest +2 and Vet Cloud Rest Hard Mode, which are fairly difficult fights. So it's just easier to get the Mother Sorrow jewelry just because you're able to purchase that off of guild traders. And then we have our front bar here. It's an Inferno staff. We are going with double Inferno staves, and then we have the Maelstrom Inferno staff on the back bar. Now for our armor traits and enchants, as well as jewelry and weapons, I have all divines. Infused large pieces is mathematically stronger. It's a little bit stronger. It's about 0.2% DPS stronger for each infused max Magicka enchant piece that you have. I just stick with all divines here just because it's easiest for me. It comes in divines from the PTS. However, if you do manage to get a infused large piece drop, by all means you can use that as well. You just want to keep in mind that if you have that health enchant because you're running Lambris or Zaan, that the health enchant piece has to be divines. It can't be infused because you're not getting any additional DPS out of an infused health glyph. For our jewelry, I have 1 Bloodthirsty, 2 Arcane. However, you can go with 3 Bloodthirsty. 3 Bloodthirsty is going to be consistently higher. They should say more consistent, as well as usually a little bit higher than running 2 Bloodthirsty or 1 Bloodthirsty or no Bloodthirsty. And go with any real combination between 3 Bloodthirsty and 3 Arcane, though. The DPS difference between them is pretty small. It normally fluctuates between 1 to 2% DPS, so it's not really all that important that you have 3 Bloodthirsty. You can go with 3 Arcane and still pull very similar DPS. Now, Magicka Sustain is pretty low. It's not great. It's better than Sork's. It's not. But at the same time, it's not obviously as good as Magicka Nightblades or Magicka Sorcerers, Magicka Wardens, but so you do need a little bit of help with sustaining full light attack rotation. So we do have a Magicka Regen glyph on one of our jewelry pieces, and we have spell damage glyphs on our other 2 pieces here. Now for our weapons, both of them are going to be infused. They did change how enchants work on the back bar, so if we use Blockade on the back bar, and swap to our front bar. It'll continue to proc the Infused enchant on the back bar rather than our front bar enchant. So we have our flame damage glyph now on the back bar. That's going to give us the most amount of DPS. Now for our front bar glyph, you do have several options here. So I have an Absorb Magic enchant here to help with sustain. So this will give us, if it procs on cooldown, an effective 230 additional regen per second. It's going to be closer to about 190 to 200 in reality, but it is a fairly nice boost to our sustain. If you're in a group where you have orbs and you have worm going, you're not going to need that Absorb Magic enchant. Instead, you can run a shock glyph instead. So I will actually swap out this glyph for a shock damage glyph, so you guys can get a sense of the DPS you're able to pull, as well as a kind of an idea of where sustain stands if you have one regen glyph. So I will replace this with shock enchant before we do our 6-man dummy parse. So those are your main enchant options here. So another thing I do want to point out here is your front bar set here. So Mother Sorrow is a purchasable set. You can buy it off of guild traders. While Inferno staves are going to be fairly expensive, gold is fairly easy to come by if you know how to trade. If you farm a couple of good pieces, you can also just farm it from the public dungeon in Deshaun. That being said, though, if you don't want to run Mother Sorrow, you don't want to buy it, you don't want to farm it, there are a few sets you could farm instead. So you could go with Burning Spellweave if you're not running it on the body already. So that's one option there. You could potentially go with Julianos if you would like. It's kind of the same concept behind Mother Sorrow, just with spell damage instead of spell crit. Julianos is easier to obtain, so it has a crafted set, so there is that advantage there. I already mentioned you don't want to run Master Architect because you will have to move your bars around, and that's just not great overall. You could do it, but you will have to swap some skills and abilities around, which might throw your rotation off a little bit. So it is possible, but it's better off just to run Master Architect on your body instead, and just forego Siroria. But again, that's kind of up to you. You could, by all means, run Crescent Sweep on the front bar, and I can show you guys the bar setup that I would do if I were to do that. Then the last set I do want to mention here real quick is going to be Moon Dancer. So Moon Dancer, you're kind of at the mercy of RNG if you're using Moon Dancer. You either get the regen proc or you get the spell damage proc, but both of them are very strong. Obviously, the regen helps to sustain. Obviously, it's not going to do you much good towards the beginning of the fight, but if you get the regen proc in the middle or towards the end of the fight where you are already running low on resources, then it's a very nice boost to have. And of course, the spell damage buff is always very nice to have. It's actually fairly strong. It's a very strong buff. It's not quite as strong as Burning Spellweave, so it's not... you won't necessarily get as high uptime. So if you average around, let's say, pull out... let me just pull it out real quick so you guys can get a sense of the level here. So as you can see here, it's only 432 with purple, and it goes up to I think 445 when it's gold or something like that, or 440. So it's not quite as big of a boost compared to Burning Spellweave, which is 525, and it's not going to have quite as much uptime. So there is that. It is a nice buff, but it's not going to be quite as strong as Burning Spellweave, even when you take into consideration Burning Spellweave uptime and Moon Dancer uptime. Right, so that's all of our gear options here. Let's go ahead and go over our character sheets. This is just generic build information. So we have our race, which is Dark Elves. The Dunmer are the strongest options for Templars, mainly because of the increased percentage of fire damage that we're doing. You could go with any of the other magically inclined races as well, so ultimately High Elves or Bretons. Those are good options as well. Dark Elves, and generally speaking, are going to be stronger, again, because of that additional fire damage. So Dark Elves get 7% additional flame damage, compared to the High Elves 4%, and the Bretons don't get any additional flame damage at all. So Dunmer do get additional 2% shock and 2% frost, compared to Altmer's 4% for both of them, and Bretons, again, don't have any sort of additional damage there. So those are kind of the main difference, and that's why Dark Elves are stronger, just because Templars have a little bit more fire damage than they do shock damage, even with the shock damage glyph. That being said, though, Altmer do have 9% additional Magicka Regen. Dark Elves do not have any sort of additional sustain boost. Bretons have 3% cost reduction in Magicka, as well as an additional about 3960 spell resistance. So that really helps out your survivability if you're a Breton. So all three races do have their strengths and weaknesses. But if you're looking to max out your DPS, Dark Elves are the best option. For attribute points, 64 points in the Magicka. So that gives us 16.3k health with that 1 health glyph and running Witchmother's Potent Brew. If you're running Clockwork Citrus Filet instead, which is the gold version of Witchmother's, you'll have a little bit more health. But we do have access to shields, so if this is a fairly acceptable amount of health here. You can put a couple points into health if you prefer to have a little bit more health for a little bit more survivability. Personally, I wouldn't put more than about 10 points into health, just because at that point you're giving up a little bit too much into max Magicka, so your DPS trade-off there really isn't going to be worth the additional survivability. For Amundus Stone, you have two options. You can run the Thief, or you can run the Apprentice. It's kind of up to you which one you want to run. So both of them are pretty much neck and neck with each other. So I prefer to go with the Thief, just because Templars do have 10% additional crit damage compared to other classes, with the exception being the Nightblades. So the Thief, I would prefer the Thief personally, but again, like I said, they're pretty similar to each other. It all really depends on the specific enchant you're running, as well as the specific gear that you're running. Then, like I said, we're running Witchmother's Potent Brew. You can go with Clockwork Citrus Filet instead, just a slightly upgraded version of Witch. It is a little bit expensive. It's about 2k per piece right now on PCNA because it uses Perfect Row. So don't feel like you have to use it for every raid. Witchmother is perfectly fine as a food choice. Now for skills, if you are not using Master Architect on your front bar, you have Elemental Weapon, Blazing Spear, Purifying Light, Radiant Depression, Inner Light, and Fiery Rage. This is going to be our primary ultimate that you're going to be using if you're not running Master Architect. You're going to be using Fiery Rage, the Destro ulti. For our back bar, we have Vampire's Bane, Blockade of Fire, Channeled Focus. This is where we would put our shield. We would be using Dampen Magic or Harness Magicka. Right now we have Elemental Drain for the purposes of the parse. Rearming Trap, or if you are playing at range, you can go with Channel Acceleration instead. If you are playing at melee range though, definitely go with Rearming Trap. That's because it uses your secondary resource compared to your primary resource, Magicka. So that's will help out your sustain if you use Rearming Trap. This is Channel Acceleration. And then Crescent Sweep, we typically will not be using this, especially when you're not using Master Architect. This is mainly here for the additional Blazing Spear passive, Piercing Spear, which gives us the 10% additional crit damage that I mentioned earlier. And we do need to have an Adric Spear ability slotted. Now, if we are going to go with Master Architect on our front bar, you'd obviously swap where your ultimates are at. So you'd have Destro ulti back here, and you have Presence Empowering Sweep over here. Then you will need to swap Blazing Spear with Vampire's Bane. So this is your bar setup. If you were going to be doing Master Architect front bar, you basically swap your Blazing Spear and Vampire's Bane, and you swap where your ultimates are. So you have sweeps in the front now instead of in the back. We'll just swap these out. Now, I do want to mention here that we are using Elemental Weapon, so you can use this at melee or range, so that's kind of the strength of Elemental Weapon. You can go with Puncturing Sweep if you would like. It doesn't do quite as much DPS as Elemental Weapon does, so that's kind of the downside, and it can only be used within melee range, so that's something you want to take into consideration. And then you could also, if you want, run either more of a Force Shock, so Crushing Shock, or Force Pulse. It is going to be worse sustained because it is more expensive, so that is an option here. You do also definitely want to have Crushing Shock on standby, just because as a ranged interrupt, just because there are going to be trials where you will need to have Crushing Shock available in order to interrupt an enemy that might be far away. Now for our champion points. CP cap is 780. Gives us 260 points to put across each of the 3 different constellations, starting off with our green CPs. We have 75 in Arcanist, 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 110 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes. Really, however you'd like, you can split them up depending on the passives that you want. So, for example, you might want to have the Treasure Hunter passive, in which case you would just put 75 points into any of these 4 nodes here. So I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and then 30 Warlord. There's not enough points in order to get even jump points here, so you will be missing one of the jump points if you decide to go 75-75. For our blue CPs, I do want to again reiterate that we are kind of focusing in on an optimized group. So we have very good Alkosh uptime, and we have very good Infused Crusher uptime. So for that reason, we have 18 points in a Spell Erosion. Now, depending on your group, whether you're running Alkosh or not, you might need to put more points in the Spell Erosion here. It's kind of up to you. It's kind of up to your group. One thing I will mention here is if you're not running Alkosh, just go with the Lover as your Munda Stone instead of dumping points into Spell Erosion. That'll let you take points out of Spell Erosion, so that way you can keep good percentages on your passives. Do need to put more points into Spell Erosion because your Crusher uptime or Alkosh uptime is not quite as good. You have 14 points into Staff Expert. You can shift these out of Staff Expert and put them into Spell Erosion, so that gives you 14 more points. Then you can take 5 points out of Elfborn and put them into Spell Erosion, so that gives you 19 more points, which will push you up to 37 points into Spell Erosion. So that's kind of where you would kind of take shift points around if you were, and you do need more points into Spell Erosion. So I have 66 Elfborn, 64 Elemental Expert, 18 Spell Erosion, 14 Staff Expert, 61 Master at Arms, and 37 Thaumaturge. You can shift 5 points out of Staff Expert here and put them into Master at Arms here if you would like. It's kind of up to you. There's really that much difference between the two of them. And then finally for our red CPs, so this particular approach is kind of a more balanced approach, so it'll give you good mitigation across all different content in the game. However, if you want to optimize your mitigation for any one single piece of content, you will need to shift some points around. 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick-Skinned, 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and that leaves 10 points, which we're going to put into Bastion for the Field Physician passive. As a Magplar, you do have faster res speed. You res in 5 seconds compared to 7, so you'll typically be the first person to go res somebody. You also res them at full health rather than half health. So having that Field Physician passive in order to reduce your damage taken is a very nice thing to have, especially if you're going to be resing a lot. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the build. So I will make that shock enchant on the front bar. You can also make a weapon damage glyph on the front bar if you would like. It's kind of up to you personally, and based on a couple of tests that other people have done, shock on the front is going to be stronger than weapon damage for single target DPS, but having a weapon damage enchant on the front bar might be a good option for admirals. Now, quickly going over a rotation on the 3 million W before we do our parse, just to kind of talk you through it. So everything here kind of matches up fairly decently except for Vampire's Bane. So Vampire's Bane has an 11-second duration, Blockade has 8, Spear has 8, Purifying Light has a 6-second duration, but we can fit that into our rotation fairly easily. So because of this, we do have a little bit of a dynamic rotation going on here. So just because we do need to maintain good uptime with Vampire's Bane, so we will have to bar swap here and there in the middle of our rotation to re-up Vampire's Bane, so that's just something to keep in mind there. So obviously going into it, you kind of want to make sure you're buffed up, so if you're using Channel Acceleration, have that going, otherwise start off with Rearming Trap. They did change how Channel Focus works, so if you drop it, you will always have the buffs on you for 20 seconds, and just standing in it just basically doesn't rebuff you, it just gives you 50% additional buff on your Ward and Resolve. So that's something to take into consideration there. So quick demonstration of our rotation here. So we do our buffs. Now, because the buff actually does run out when the 20 seconds runs down, you do want to re-up it before it completely expires. As you can see here, it's a very dynamic rotation here. It's not quite as bad as the Magicka Nightblade when it comes to the amount of bar swapping we're doing, but it is a fair amount of bar swapping, so it is a lot of dot tracking and making sure things are lining up very well. Purifying Light, you will need to make sure that it completely expires before you recast it. It's something that I actually learned fairly recently, is that if you recast it early, it actually won't, the second hit actually won't go off. So you do want to make sure you are making sure that second hit does go off. Alright, so with that all said and done, let's go ahead and do our 6 million dummy parse here, so that way you guys can get an idea of the amount of DPS I'm able to pull, and can compare that to other builds here and there. Now again, I am using a shock damage glyph on the front bar rather than the Absorb Magic enchant, so you guys have a little bit of an idea of what your sustain is like with one regen glyph. So hopefully I will not run out of Magicka too quickly here. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started here with this parse. One thing I forgot to mention, and I'll talk about actually while we're parsing, is going to be execute. In other words, when do we start using our J-beam? Do I want to keep my dots going while we're doing our J-beam? The answer is you do want to keep your dots going for your J-beam, but not for the entire duration. So the recommendation is to use J-beam once, starting at 30%. So you will keep on, basically you're running your dots, just do one J-beam, and then do spambles after that J-beam is over. And you'll see it where we get to execute phase in our parse here. So you will actually drop Purifying Light typically while you're using J-beam. So we're at 30%. You do is do one J-beam. You re-up your dots. And you do one J-beam. And then once you hit around 20% or so, that's when you want to do two J-beams. And then when you hit 10%, you want to drop all your dots and just do pure J-beam. Obviously, I'm going to reapply. The one that you still want to keep up though is definitely going to be Blockade and Spear. Alright, so real quick, more into the execute phase. So starting at 30%. So let's say we're this dummy on this dummy here, before we go into our comment part, metrics parse. So when I say you want to do one J-beam, so let's say you're on your back rotation, you would drop Purifying Light and you do one J-beam. So that's kind of what it means. So we hit 30% here. And then when we hit around 20%, I like to drop Vampire's Bane. So just maintain Blockade and Spear. Now 10%, it's kind of up to you if you want to keep on re-upping Blockade and Spear. I personally do, and then just do Blockade, Spear, J-beam twice, and repeat that over and over again. You also want to keep on maintaining Rearming Trap as well. So it'd be Blockades, Spear, J-beam, J-beam, like so. And if you do need to re-up Rearming Trap, then I'd put that down as well. But let's go over our parse here. So this is our actual parse here, so 43k. Again, this is with a shock damage glyph, so we do have some minor vulnerability uptime, about 54%. Oops, wrong button. So we can see here that J-beam does tick harder than it used to. We got a little bit lucky with crits here. So we got 77% of our hits were crits, but the max was 48k. This is, again, without raid buffs, so we don't have minor berserk or anything like that. So we are pulling really good numbers. When you compare them to other Magicka DPS, we're actually beating out Sorks by a small amount here. So that's nice to see that Mag players are beating out Mag Sorks again. Of course, that Mag Sorks still have a unique synergy with Conduit, so Mag Sorks is still a little bit more valuable because alpha uptime is still very strong and very important for group DPS. But you can see here that the changes to the infused backbar enchants means that the fire damage glyph is much higher on the DPS contribution now. Charged weapon this is the one on the front bar here. We're getting pretty good uptime on this as well, 40 compared to 55. So really nice. It also helps with minor vulnerability uptime. So again, very important to have here. One thing I do want to bring out here is Burning Light. So Burning Light is a passive under the Aegis Spear line and basically gives you a chance to do some additional magic damage every time you deal damage with a Aegis Spear ability. So in this case, Blazing Spear. Burning Light actually does more DPS than the dot portion of Blazing Spear. So this is the initial hit, and this is the dot. So you can see here that it actually does a little bit more DPS than the actual dot from Blazing Spear. So that's why we also still want to maintain Blazing Spear during execute because Burning Light is still a very nice passive, very nice DPS contributor. Alright, so that is it for this build video. If you guys have any questions about Magplars, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I personally used to play Magplar fairly often before Morrowind happened, then they nerfed Sustain. So not many people play Magplars anymore, just because Morrowind didn't really kill it, but it did a really good job at beating it down. So right now I only know of one, maybe two people who play Magplars as like their main DPS specs. So if I don't know the answer, they definitely will, because they've been sticking with Magplars since Morrowind. So I'll ask them and relay that answer back to you if you do have a question that I'm not able to answer. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.